Please find a seat. And I would like to invite, thank you, Dr. Nechama Price, to moderate.
Hi, I can now safely say good afternoon, everybody. It is an honor for me to moderate this panel commemorating the 10th Yahrzeit of Rav Lichtenstein on the topic of Rav Aharon as Rebbe and Educator. I am Dr. Nechama Price, Director of GPATS, the Graduate Program in Advanced Talmud and Tanakh Studies for Women at Yeshiva University. I teach at Stern College, and I serve as the Yoetzet Halacha in many communities, including Teaneck. I'd like to thank our panelists, Rabbi Michael Taubes, Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University and Rabbi of Congregation Zichron Mordechai, Rabbi Daniel Fridman, Rebbe at TABC, and Rabbi of the Jewish Center of Teaneck, and Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zuckier, Research Associate at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and Consulting Editor of the Tradition Journal. Thank you for joining us today. I've always said I'm a Gush wannabe, watching my brother learn at Gush, later my husband, and now my son. Over the years, I've had many, many teachers who are Talmidim of Rav Lichtenstein, and so I am certainly a benefactor of his Torah, even if not directly. Though I am not privileged to be numbered amongst his Talmidim, I did have the opportunity to learn from him in person. During my Shana Bet in Israel, I was part of a small group of women who were unofficially invited to join Rav Lichtenstein's Ramban Shir on the Grus campus. Each week, I and a group of women would literally sneak into the back of his shir and learn from him directly. My first impression of him is so memorable. I remember struggling to understand anything he said. His enunciation was unfamiliar, his vocabulary was expansive and overwhelming. But coming back week after week, it became clear that I was in the presence of a gadol, and even if I only understood 1% of what he said, I was being given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be in his presence and learn his Torah. Which leads me to my first question that I would like to ask all the panelists to address. It's a two-part question. Number one, what were your first impressions upon meeting Rav Lichtenstein at Yeshiva? And number two, as you gained a greater exposure to Rav Aharon, certain interactions certainly stand out in your mind. Can you share, please, one single story of an interaction between you and Rav Aharon that best exemplifies how he related to you and to his Talmidim in general? We'll start with Rabbi Taubes, then Rabbi Fridman, and then Rabbi Zuckier.
Thank you very much. The first time I met him formally, in terms of his role as the Rosh Yeshiva, was I went for the Bechina, which took place at that time in one of these side rooms on the first floor, now known as the Zeisman Hall building in YU. And I came for my Bechina to see if I'd get admitted to Gush, and I was quite nervous and wasn't really sure what to expect. His reputation came well before him, but okay, we had a conversation, and as he started to ask me questions, I prepared the Gemara in advance. I realized right then and there that this man is of a different personality, because he clearly had a very organized and straight, penetrating analysis of the sugya, which I'm not sure how I did in the Bechina. I guess it was well enough to get into Yeshiva, but I realized, oh my gosh, I don't really know that much about what he's talking about. But yet he did it in such a way that it was so kind and so warm that I realized, wow, this is a person I need to get to, to get to experience more. In the Yeshiva itself, when you met him, you recognized immediately, as Dr. Price said before, you were in the presence of greatness. Not just Torah greatness, because he would give a shir kloli in my days in Yeshiva on certain afternoons. He would speak for probably about 2 hours. And then when he finished at 2 hours, and you're trying to keep up and take notes and so on, in the last 5 minutes, he would say, Tov, l'sakein. Okay, now to summarize. And he went over in about 5 minutes, point by point, exactly what he'd said. How is it possible for the person to remember all of that? So you recognize the person's greatness, but also his greatness as a person. He was just such a gentleman. He had such refinement of character that I really never seen such a thing. And he was such a humble person. There's a story, people were walking the hall in Yeshiva, and there was a boy, a Talmud there named Aharon, and one of his friends said to him, to the Talmud, the friend of his said, Aharon, do you have an extra pen? And he turned around and goes, no, I'm sorry. No, not you. I mean, it would have been me. I would have dug a hole. But that was his personality. He was so humble. And I think that's the impression that I had, that I first had. In terms of personal stories, there were many. In my time in the yeshiva, Rabbi used to give shiurim on Ramban al Torah on Fridays. And then afterwards, he'd go back to Yerushalayim. Either for Shabbos, he would stay in Yerushalayim, or he'd pick up his family and come back later. And after the shiur was over, he would go to his car, and anyone who had to go to Yerushalayim, wanted to get a ride, in those days it was a bigger schlep than it is today, would try and go down to his car to see if he had room. You'd go to Yerushalayim. So whenever I had to go to Yerushalayim for Shabbos, I would try and get a ride. The first 5 or 6 people there, call Kodem Zocha, would go. Sometimes, I didn't have to go to Yerushalayim. But if there was no one else who had to go to Yerushalayim, I would run down to the car anyway. And if no one else was sitting there, I would go in anyway. And then when I get there, I'd take the bus and come back to Yeshiva. I just wanted to be in his presence. And I guess he understood that. I was a strange fellow who always seemed to try and come in the car. But I just wanted to get to know him more, to get to know him better. And on a personal level, I remember when I became, years and years ago, the first time around the principal of YU High School, MTA, he spoke to me, because it was right around the time he was in America. He just had such pride that a student of his, a talmid of his had come to this point. One of my treasured svarim that I have at home, one of his svarim, I think they're selling some in the back here. People want to take a look afterwards, but he inscribed to me, and he referred to me as Talmud Vosik, which is a complimentary phrase that I just, that I take to heart to this day. And the last thing I'll mention, a number of years ago, one of my daughters had a question that I felt would best to have Aharon deal with, and I brought her to him, and he sat with her for an hour, which by itself was unbelievable, but he began the conversation by saying, I don't really know you, I know your father, I don't really know you, so let me talk to you like I talk to my own daughter. That's how he introduced the comment. So as I talk about the gentleman, aside from his tremendous scope of knowledge, and with a kodesh, with a chol, just the refinement of character is something that made a tremendous impression upon me.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Price, and thank you to all of the organizers. I'll just say Bershos Maradasra and also Bershos Avimori, which actually is sort of a beginning point for my brief answer to the question. So my first impressions of Rav Lichtenstein in Yeshiva really weren't my first impressions in an absolute sense. My father learned in the Yeshiva obviously many years before I did, necessarily, 1975, and then again in 1979. And we were raised that, the goal was to try to get to be a talmid of Rav Lichtenstein, and that was a good enough goal for me. So I was primed in a certain sense to realize that, what it was all about. And all of that being said, it wasn't any less overwhelming for me. And I would just say it was Yiraso Kodemes Lechachmaso. The first memory I have of the Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva, as we used to call him, was actually, we just davened mincha. It was my first mincha of the Elzman, and Rav Lichtenstein said Kaddish after Aleinu. Such a Kaddish I had never heard in my life, and I've never heard in my life. It literally was exalting the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, every single word, and listening to it was itself a religious experience. As I said, Yiraso Kodemes Lechachmaso. We had a few days to prepare, and then Rav Lichtenstein said a shir psicha. We were learning ksuvos that year. The topic was ksuva d'oraisa d'Rabbanan, a very classical topic. The shir was over 3 hours. We had prepared my chavrusa and myself. We prepared very diligently for 2 days, and I think I understood the first 6 minutes, and then the part Rabbi Taubes referenced the sikum, the first 6 seconds of the sikum. So I knew I had a lot of work to do. But I was very honored to be able to try to do it. I think just a very brief vignette. You asked later impressions. Actually, my last very vivid memory of Rav Lichtenstein was with my father also. My father had to pose a question of gravity to Rav Lichtenstein. I went with my father. Rav Lichtenstein was at the time in his son Rav Yitzi's house, who's now the Rosh Yeshiva Torah V'das, and then there's a Rav in Monsey, so we sat with our Rosh Yeshiva there. And I remember to this day, feeling what a deep privilege it was to be next to my father and to be with my Rebbe and with his Rebbe. It's certainly a feeling that I carry with me every day.
First of all, thank you very much to the organizers, the hosts, and everyone for coming here. I have a similar origin story in terms of my relationship to Rav Lichtenstein, to Rabbi Fridman, in that my father also studied in the yeshiva in the Gush, and growing up, Rav Lichtenstein was the model, the spiritual model, and I would add that once I entered, we spent my seventh grade, we were in Katamon, so I'd see Rav Lichtenstein around. I think I may have gone to the same makolet referenced earlier. But when I entered high school, I started having some questions about how to understand biblical figures, as we heard about. Unfortunately, I had missed that Malava Malka in 1983. So I had these questions, and my father arranged for me to meet with Rav Lichtenstein and to discuss these issues. And he somehow cleared 45 minutes of his time to speak to some brooding teenager about these important issues. It made an impression on me, and one of the reasons that I wanted to come to the yeshiva was because I had been primed to see Rav Lichtenstein as the primary, the Gadol Ador I looked up to, and what yeshiva do you have the opportunity to not just learn, but to learn in the presence of the Gadol Ador. Once I reached yeshiva, I would say, I won't give specific, can't remember the first 6 minutes that I did or didn't understand, but seeing the profile of Rav Lichtenstein was something that really affected me in three different ways that I think I figured out in stages. So first, just the intensity of Rav Lichtenstein. Everything he did was extremely intense. The Kaddish, davening more generally, every shiur going to the max. People mentioned going over on time. So every time you'd have shiur yomi, it would go at least 10 minutes into lunch, which I think wasn't for lack of organization. Rav Lichtenstein was extremely organized, but it was a message. You're in yeshiva not because you want to get first on the lunch line. You're in yeshiva for the learning and just the hierarchy of values. But that was part of the intensity to everything that Rav Lichtenstein did. And after a little bit of time, you realize, but it's not just intensity, it's this broad-ranging complexity, right? Every issue, anytime you ask a question, we'd have these the question and answer sessions. And any question you would ask, first you have to break down the question into multiple parts, and there's different values that are competing, and you need to figure out the correct balance, and it might depend on the person. Every issue was so complex, not to mention in terms of shiur, in terms of the way that learning happened. Every sugya has multiple pieces that need to be broken down. And just thinking about that, it's extremely uncommon. Usually the most intense people, you have one thing, you keep sounding that same note, you know it inside and out, and that's your whole personality. Or the complex people, they do complexity well, but you can't really get intensity out of them. They're never going to double down on something. They're never going to take something to its fullest extent. And Rav Lichtenstein somehow was able to combine these two things, and I think that's the third level of appreciation I reached at some point, which is this idea of integration, being able to integrate all aspects of his life. I think Rai Tarragon spoke to this earlier. Both, of course, Talmud Torah in the base medrash, giving Gemara Be'iyun Shiurim, giving Hashkafa Shiurim, but thinking about life more broadly, seeing everything in Hashem's world as part of our avodas Hashem, channeling it, and doing so with an appreciation for the complexity of the world and intensity. That's this integration, this third factor in Rav Aharon's teaching that I was able to appreciate over my time in yeshiva. In terms of, if you want stories, we were asked to give stories. So in light of that, and I've seen this from other Talmidim too, but I related to Rav Aharon from both the perspective of ahava, great love and appreciation for my Rebbe, but also out of a deep sense of yira, of just being in the presence of someone with such greatness, with such intensity. almost not being able to, recoiling at some sense at the greatness, the fear people mentioned of asking questions, some combination of yira and ahava. So one story for each. First, the yira. When I was in yeshiva for a few years, I joined the kollel that would have chaburas every week, and it rotated. Rav Aharon would give a chabura, one of the other rabbanim would give a chabura on a topic b'iyun every week, and you would rotate in some of the guys in the kollel. So it was a couple weeks after Sukkot, and Rav Aharon had gone a couple times, and the other Rebbe had gone. None of the Talmidim had gone. So Rav Aharon says, "Who wants to give the chabura next week?" No one raises their hand, and everyone's trying to hide a little bit. And then he's Zuckier. Right? He said, I'm on for next week. He told me I'm on, and that must have been the most stressful week of my life. I didn't get diagnosed, but I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I must have been stressed on a level unimaginable. And the day of the chabura came, I gave the chabura, and as Rav Willig mentioned before, you don't just give the chabura, you get critiqued, right? So, I think thankfully there was some positive feedback, but the main point of the chabura you built up to, I don't know if that's correct. So that was the big takeaway. But I think I gained a lot in terms of the focus, in terms of doing your best, realizing you don't always succeed. But that was one on the yira side of things. In terms of ahava, and this is going to connect actually very closely to Rabbi Taubes' story. This is my first year in yeshiva. In the summer, there was an extra Gemara B'Iyon Shir in the afternoons because, of course, there was always extra Gemara B'Iyon Shir. Rav Aharon didn't have enough things in his schedule. If guys asked him for, Iyun on a certain topic, he would teach it. As a first year in yeshiva, I was twiddling with my pen a little bit. It fell under the table in front. And I'm taking notes by hand. I need the pen, so I try reaching for it. I try asking someone. Rav Willig notices what's going on, and in the middle of his shir, he's Tatzuchit. And I'm like, I'm not sure if I heard correctly. I keep trying to get and then he always spoke in Hebrew, Beshita in his shirim. Do you need a pen? And I was melting of embarrassment. And in the end, he gave me the pen. I don't think I was able to take notes on the rest of the shir regardless. But that was Rav Aharon in a sense of Ava. Both his love for his Talmidim. He sees someone struggling. Should I really interrupt the whole shir to give Zuckier a pen? But he really wanted to help support a Talmud, and I think not only a funny story, but another story involving Rav Aharon and pens, and reflecting his great Ava for his Talmidim.
Okay, thank you. Those were great stories. We are now going to address the topics of Rav Aharon's methodology, hashkafa, and derech halimud, and I'm going to ask each panelist to address only one of these topics. So we are going to start with Rabbi Taubes. Rabbi Taubes, in your role as an educator, where and how do you interact with the legacy of Rav Lichtenstein? In what ways do you utilize his methodological approach in your own teachings?
Just before addressing the question, I have to mention being a couple years older than both Rabbi Fridman and Rabbi Zuckier, my father did not learn in Gush. However, he and Rav Aharon were classmates in YU, and they were both English majors. And my father ended up teaching English in YU, and Rav Lichtenstein went to Stern College at that time to teach English over there. Another time I'll tell you a story how that ended up happening. But in any event, I did have a relationship. I just didn't really know him, but going back to the previous door as well. As was mentioned, Aharon always spoke in Shir in Hebrew, and sometimes you had to ask the Israelis, like, what did that word mean? And they didn't know either. It was like, I remember I was sitting next to a fellow, I shrugged his shoulder, because had this advanced vocabulary. But I remember one time when I and another fellow were discussing something with him after the Shir, but I think there were a couple of people standing around, a few Americans and an Israeli, and so we're doing it in Hebrew so the Israeli would understand, and he was getting exasperated, we didn't understand, and we asked the question, he said, yeah, aval, right? He gave you a yeah, that was like, and all of a sudden it slipped back into his native tongue, or Native American tongue, anyway. In terms of his methodology, so I have to point out that it's not exactly the style of learning that I generally pursue, except in one major area, and really this was a major influence, and that is his thoroughness of investigating the sources. Rav Aharon did not just varf stuff out. He to throw stuff out. He would look and wanted to see what did the Rishonim and all the Rishonim, not just necessarily the ones that are quoted in the Shulchan Aruch and so on, but what do all the Rishonim have to say about it? And that's why we were introduced at that time. I mean, I had a little learning behind me before I came to the yeshiva, but I never looked up a Rav Yard or a Zerua for the most part. Those were not Rishonim that people tended to investigate in regular shiurim. Aharon was, if nothing, if not for extraordinarily thorough. And that's something which I've tried to emulate in my own learning and my own teaching, to go through sources, to see what everyone has to say, to present, because, and along those lines, when you looked at different sources, as he did, you picked up a different nuance. You picked up something, even though these two Rishonim may have said more or less the same thing or have come to the same conclusion halachically, but there was a nuance of a difference. And he considered that important. He wanted his Talmidim, I understand it, to see that. And that's something I've tried to do with my own Talmidim and my own teaching, to emphasize thoroughness of looking up sources, of seeing what everyone has to say and trying to pick up on those nuances. So I think that's one methodological approach which I know I gained from him, and I was terrifically impressed, as was everybody, with the breadth, but not just the breadth, but the depth. Okay, to look into each source thoroughly and see why does this one have this nuanced approach? Why does the other one have a slightly different nuanced approach? Where are they coming from, and so on? That's something which which made a tremendous impression upon me. But the other thing, again, going back to his personality of being that refined character, that person who is polite and who is friendly, who is tolerant, who relates to his Talmidim, that's something which I don't know the success or not, but I've tried to emulate as well in dealing with students. He was just somebody who, the Gemara says that we many times we have disputes in the Gemara between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and we paskin as a general rule, like Beis Hillel with various exceptions, we paskin Beis Hillel because the Gemara mentioned that Beis Hillel had certain midos tovos, certain good quality. When they recorded an argument, they would give preference to the other position and so on. And one can wonder, what's that got to do with psak? I mean, that's the area of midas tovos, and we should emulate midas tovos, but why does that mean? And it's not separate. It's not separate. Okay, midas tovos and character refinement, that goes into your role as a posek. And to the extent that I've a little bit, having me Talmid of Aharon, to be a certain type of person. I can't say I successfully emulated it, and I'm not just saying false, modesty, but, because he was unique in that regard. And the truth is, going back to my father, and I'll finish with this, when I was debating where to go for yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, I remember my father, Shalom, telling me, you should go where you think you're going to learn the best. But he said, if all else is equal, then you should go to Rosh, because you're not likely to meet somebody like Aharon Lichtenstein anywhere else. And that was ultimately what convinced me that that's where I had to go. And again, the combination of being thorough in terms of investigating sources and being a personality that students can hopefully emulate and look up to, and that affects their learning, those are two of the, I don't necessarily say methodological approaches, but stylistic approaches that I've at least tried to emulate.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Taubes. Next up, Rabbi Fridman. Rav Lichtenstein was a humanist for whom passion and emotional depth of human experience was profound. Explain how his sensitivity to the human condition affected his approach to the teaching of hashkafa.
Okay, so Rav Lichtenstein, as everybody here knows, would really analyze. Anytime he was posed a question in any forum, he would analyze all of the different clauses in the question, very, very thoroughly. So I'll just point out that I'm supposed to, explain how the depth of Rav Lichtenstein's sensitivity, impacted his approach, especially in hashkafa. To say that would be impossible for me because the depths of his sensitivity are very, very far beyond, my emotional range. But I'll try the best I can. Also, largely by way of anecdote. The Mishnah Pirkei Avos tells us, "Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem Elokim." If you watched Rav Lichtenstein, literally in any setting, you saw this Maimar Chazal come to life. The respect with which he treated each human being and each Tzelem Elokim. It was truly singular, as my co-panelists have noted. The Rambam has a psak halacha in Avel Yadal et Aleph. The Rambam writes that there are certain mitzvahs that are midrabanan. The Ma'aseh mitzvah it's a debate, but like things like Nichum Avelim, etc. Others, the Bahag, think it might be Daraisa, but you get credit for doing the mitzvah Daraisa, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, when you perform these mitzvahs Darabanan, there's a kiyum Daraisa, the Rambam says. That psak, for me, came to life with Rav Lichtenstein's Hanhagos, and I felt like more than any frontal hashkafa shir, the way that he interacted with people, and I'll share some very, very brief stories, was like the ultimate shir in hashkafa, where you saw that sense of avas re'im, whatever the specific maisa was, whatever the maisa mitzvah, the avas re'im was overwhelming. So two very brief stories, and they could be legion, just because I experienced these things personally. One of them was on Yom HaZikaron. It's going to be Yom HaZikaron this week. I was in Yeshiva. It had been just over 20 years since what was then called the Lebanon War, what now would be called the First Lebanon War, or Shlomo Galil. And a mother was speaking of one of the fallen Talmidim of the Yeshiva. And I sat in the back row of the Yeshiva. And for whatever reason, Rav Lichtenstein came in like 30 seconds late, and out of great respect for the speaker, he didn't want to go to a seat in the front of the base medrash, so he sat down right where Rabbi Zuckier is, right next to me. And she was speaking of her son. And about 15 minutes into her presentation, she broke down, and she couldn't continue at just the anguish. What I saw, I sometimes have trouble actually knowing or realizing that it really happened, but it happened. It just it was almost like a surreal experience. So these are only seconds, but maybe in the 1 or 2 seconds when she started to break down before she literally stopped talking, Rav Lichtenstein noticed this, and the Chazal have a concept called kfitzas hadrachim. There's a dispute between Rashi and the Ramban. Exactly what kfitzas hadrachim means. Does it mean that the person moves very quickly, or does the earth move in some cases? I'm not sure which one it was, but in like a microsecond, Rav Lichtenstein, and he was 70 years old at the time, flew, I can use no other word, to the front of the base medrash where she was speaking from, to be at her side and to gently escort her. I don't know how he moved so quickly before any of us realized what was happening, but her pain was his pain, and in terms of his humanism, or his the capaciousness of his heart and his ability to be nosei ba'ol im chaveiro with every human being was evident in that moment. Another just very very brief story that I personally experienced, but everybody has their own stories. But again, just about that sensitivity. So that same year, aside from my grandfather Zichron Levracha, we really didn't have survivors from our extended family from the Shoah. Most were annihilated. We had one other family member, my uncle Aaron, who survived, and he lived here in the New York metropolitan area. And when he was nifter, he was brought for kavura in Eretz Yisrael. Of course, my father told my brother and I, obviously, to represent the family in the kavura, which we of course did. And there was a minyan there, just barely a minyan, and Rav Lichtenstein came. Rav Lichtenstein had known the family at 11 Fort George Hill from his days. At this point, it was over 30 years before. But he remembered the family connection, and he felt that he should show up to the kavura. He had many things. He had many things to do, but not only did he come, but he participated, in the kavura, the Masa Yadav, and so these to me were the most powerful hashkafa shiurim. Is watching an Adam Gadol interact at the highest possible level of Ben Adam Lechavero.
Thank you. Okay. Rabbi Zuckier, I ask brief so we can do our last question afterwards. Okay, Rabbi Zuckier, what is unique about Rav Aharon's Derech HaLimud? I know this could be a 4-hour question. And what has been its impact on the Torah learning world? In 5 minutes. Good luck.
Thank you. And, I think Roy Willig mentioned before that I was one of the people asking for brevity. Now I'm on the receiving end. Feels a little different. But just imagine if I hadn't asked some of the Rabbanim on the first panel to go short, what time it would be now. So in terms of Derech HaLimud, the truth is Rav Rosenzweig, in great detail, laid out a lot of this topic, and I didn't know he would speak to that, so maybe I'll frame it, and maybe this will make it shorter, frame it more from the perspective of a Talmud. How Rav Lichtenstein's Derech made things more accessible for the Talmud, and a little bit about its impact. If we think about the brisk tradition of Lamdus, so Reb Chaim would take questions, would raise problems on the Gemara, between the Rambam and the Gemaras, between different Rambams, and resolve them with conceptual distinctions, right? There seems to be a contradiction, but really if you appreciate this conceptual distinction, everything falls into place. The Rav began a move of making the chakiras, the conceptual questions, more central and not just sort of a resolution of a problem later on. Rav Lichtenstein made the conceptual questions front and center. Whenever you have a sugya, the first question you ask is, okay, we have this topic, what are the basic principles? How does it operate? Is it a din in A or B? And B could be one of 3 different things. You sort of break down the topic, what's known as mapping out the topic ahead of time. And that was sort of how Schrier would progress, right? Rav Lichtenstein would, when he would give a frontal Schrier, he would lay out conceptual possibilities within a topic. Some of them would end up being represented by a Rishon, some of them not. But those also were part of Torah. Those are part of the potentialities, the possibilities of what the Gemara meant, and also were worth at least discussing in the way of the Schrier. From the perspective of a Talmud, so this really presents its clarity and openness and an ability to approach the Derech HaLimud. Rosenzweig touched on this a little bit before, in the sense that you can approach the sugya from a first year or second year in full-time yeshiva learning and be able to follow, assuming you can hear and all other challenges are resolved. But it's not like you need expert knowledge in the sugya to be able to appreciate the questions, let alone the answers. Everything is frontally presented in a very clear way. And I think the goal was also to help students develop their own Derech HaLimud. Whenever you approach a sugya, right, you don't necessarily approach a sugya with a lot of questions and then one answer solves everything, right? That's a great presentation that with a flourish at the end. That's not how people actually learn. If the goal is to direct students to their own Derech HaLimud, presenting a framework for how to do that, raising questions first and then analyzing is much more helpful in that direction. And that's what Rav Lichtenstein, how he framed his Schrier. In terms of the Schrier Yom, he would always call on people to read. A couple of benches were made of the Tomar, where you're called on to read in Schrier, and it wasn't just reading the words. You'd get asked important conceptual questions at every frame, right? So the Gemara says this, what does it mean? Does it mean A, or could it mean something else? And the goal was to bring the student along in the process of learning, right? Instead of, I'm the Rebbe, here's the Lumdus, take it home, it was trying to initiate students into the questions, into the approach of how to think, how to learn. And again, pedagogically, this was very important, had a real impact on generations of students. One last point, and sometimes the more you get into brisker lumdus, the more intricate the chakira, you sometimes will run into conceptual possibilities that are less than fully intuitive, let's say. Right? It's so complicated. To make it work, it must be that, and you end up with a svara like this. I can say, I can't recall any situation where Rav Lichtenstein put forward a svara that was not internally consistent and rational. If there was a challenge, he would say, I don't know how to resolve this. There was a real intellectual honesty there. Instead of saying it must be some convoluted answer, to say if it doesn't make sense, and this is part of an appeal to human rationality, if it doesn't make sense, I'm not gonna force it. I think those are all important aspects of the methodology. It's impacted through Talmidim let's see, different yeshivas in Israel and in America. High schools has had a wide impact, which we can talk more another time. I don't know if that was my time or not, but I'll stop now.
Okay, I'm going to take this last question very quickly for all the women in the room. For women of my generation and prior, access to Talmidei Chachamim and Gedolim was really limited. Rav Lichtenstein was the bridge, the transformative person who opened the world of Talmud Torah and Gedolei Torah to women. So many of his students are the pioneers of women's Talmud Torah in both America and in Israel. As C.B. Nirashel spoke before, he spoke at the opening of Mayanot. He for sure is one of the reasons why GPATS and many programs like that are in existence. So I ask each of the panelists, in very short, to please answer from your perspective, why did he believe it was so important to teach women Torah, and how did he convey that message to his students?
A couple of years before Mayanot opened and before he spoke at that event, there was a parliament meeting that was held here in Teaneck. There are a couple of people in this room might have been there, not about Mayanot per se, but about the idea of starting a yeshiva high school for girls in Teaneck. I was present there, and Lichtenstein Zichron spoke, and he spoke about the importance, basically, of having every person who's growing up in a Jewish environment and in chinuch, being educated, be exposed to the Torah from the inside. And that was a term that he used. Everybody needs to see how much time you have to spend, the Gemara, this, okay, that you can debate and discuss, and that's not for right now. But he felt very strongly, and that's what he said on that occasion, that everybody has to see the inner workings of the development of Torah, of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of Halacha, how things work from the inside. And he did not feel that gender should be a barrier to that. Again, timing, this and that, specifics, that wasn't the theme of that particular talk. He said, it's not just another subject. Okay, I remember he referred to what sometimes appears on a schedule and so on. He referred to the term toshbap, Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's another course. But for him, what he was saying was that you have to expose women as well as men, but everybody has to be exposed to the workings of Torah, of learning from the inside. And I think that's one of the things which motivated him in terms of seeing to it, especially in today's day and age, that women are also given this understanding, because I think he believed that that would enhance their religiosity, that would, it's a different world today and so on, in many, many different ways, and that would enhance their religiosity, their understanding of Torah, their commitment to Halacha, and that's what he felt very strongly about. On other occasions, he did mention that his own great Rebbeim did study Torah with their daughters. The Rav Zichron Rav Salvation Rav Hutner Zichron Rav Aharon Salvation. I think he mentioned that. I think it's in print somewhere that he learned that from him, from his great. Those were his three primary rebbeim, Aharon Salvation, Rav Hutner, and the Rav. And he said they felt that it was necessary to study Torah with their daughters, and therefore I go back to that story before. He studied with his own daughter. That's known. His own daughters, okay, and therefore felt that other people should do it too. Like I said before, he addressed my daughter and said, "That's as if." I'll talk to you as I talk to my own daughter. So I think that was his derech, and that's probably why he felt this was such an important thing. And again, the impact is clear. Also, he did stress, as was noted by the other panelists before, everything had to contribute to Avodas Hashem. That was his whole derech. Everything is activity X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Is that going to enhance your Avodas Hashem, or is it not going to enhance your Avodas Hashem? My son told me a story of a friend of his who was in Gush, who was approached when he was there by a prominent Rav who was known for being great Bal Musar and so on. And this Rav asked this Talmud, he said, "Do you study Musar here in the Yeshiva?" So he said, "Well, I don't really, you can't get against." He said, "You don't have to, just watch that man. You don't have to study Musar, just watch that man." But I believe that that's also something which he felt in terms of women's education, to have the proper role models, to see people who model that. And I think he felt there's no reason for any gender difference in this regard. I think that was certainly part of his shita.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Taubes. Just very briefly, I want to give a personal note of Akar Satov in answering this question. I obviously did not attend my note, but my wife was in the first graduating class. And I thought it was the second. So it's really from a great debt of gratitude. It's impacted our family and our children. So we're very indebted in that respect as well. I think very, very briefly, in my view, it came down to three features of Rav Lichtenstein's approach. The first I mentioned in a prior comment, which is that Rav Lichtenstein was a person who respected people enormously. People, including men and women, A part of, I think, the prerequisite to being able to approach the question the way that he did came from a place of deep, deep respect, and I don't just mean for their intellect, but for their capacity to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that the question had to be taken very, very seriously. He's a very respectful person. The second point is a narrow point, but I think a very significant one. The Rambam, the Sefer Mitzvos, when he speaks about the mitzvah of Avas Hashem, this is in a separate codification from the mitzvah of Limud Torah. The Rambam does reference achieving Avas Hashem based on the Sifrei through Limud Torah. I think Rav Lichtenstein was very concerned that people should develop Avas Hashem, and I think that all the sources, it's a very complex topic about women and Talmud Torah per se, but I think it's important to mention the Avas Hashem piece of it as well. Third, and finally, I think that it tells you something about Rav Lichtenstein's religious and spiritual sensitivity and sensibilities. So to get back to the Ben Adam L'Chaveris theme I was talking about before, the Rambam has a passage in Hilchos Deos about how we should treat almanos and yesomim. And having heard Rav Lichtenstein read this passage in the Rambam and nearly break down in tears, the Lashonos of the Rambam regarding the kinds of sensitivities we need dealing with, as the Rambam refers to them as umlalim, people. So there's no difference in halacha between how a man should treat an alman and yasum and how a woman should treat an alman and yasum. So for some people, I think it would be possible to say, okay, so tell people to be generous in spirit and with words and financially with almanos and yasomim, and that would suffice. But I think for Lichtenstein, given how connected his soul was to Torah, I think it would be very difficult for him to imagine achieving the same depth of performance of any mitzvah without, as Rabbi Taubes mentioned, seeing it on the inside. In other words, if you weren't exposed to that Rambam, that would diminish one's capacity to relate to Alman and Yasom, or to see the Rambam in Hilchos Matnos and about Tzedakah. And so I think it tells you something about the soul bonding between Rav Lichtenstein and Torah that he felt it would be helpful for women to know Makoros as well.
Just very quickly, in building on both Rabbi Taubes and Rabbi Fridman, it may help quickly to contrast Rav Lichtenstein's justification for women's learning with some others. So throughout the generations, from even some Rishonim say in order for women to keep halacha properly, they need to learn Torah. That's one justification. Better shmiras hamitzvos. Another justification attributed to the Rav is the argument that women are getting an advanced education in the secular world. If they don't learn Torah at a high level, they might be alienated from Torah. They might become not frum. For Rav Lichtenstein, this is a positive argument for avodas Hashem. As Rabbi Fridman was saying, women should learn Torah because learning Torah is the central manifestation of how one serves Hashem. And how can you be an Oved Hashem without studying Torah, and not just any area of Torah, but particularly Torah Sheba'al Peh? Rav Lichtenstein writes elsewhere that being confronted by the commander, being commanded, being mitzuvah in Torah, which bears itself out primarily through the Gemara, through Torah Sheba'al Peh, that's central to anyone's experience of avodas Hashem, and lacking that, you can't be, he doesn't say it in these words, but basically you can't be a full religious citizen without having that experience. It's at least much, much harder to experience that. And combining that focus on Talmud Torah as avodas Hashem with a focus on education as not just pre-professional vocational education, but education as forming a person's spiritual personality. As a person, as a Jew, then all of these contributed to the idea that it's absolutely necessary to have girls in high school, or women more generally, learn Torah and Torah Sheba'al Peh at a high level. One comment on what Rabbi Taubes mentioned about Toshba, which this comes up in the I saw it in the written version of the address to Maya Note, the opening address, which is, if most people who talk about there's a Mishnah and Sota, and that seems to imply women shouldn't learn because it leads to tiflos. And the argument often is, look, okay, if women learn a little bit, but not the real stuff, not the serious stuff, then it won't lead to tiflos, and that's better. And Rav Lichtenstein absolutely inverts that argument. And the argument is, as Rabbi Taubes was saying, there needs to be a serious engagement with Torah from the inside. If you do a half-baked, okay, we'll tell you some general ideas, we'll give you a handout, but you won't actually see things in the Gemara, you'll get a half-baked view of what Torah is, of what Torah Sheba'al Peh is. And if you only have that mixed perspective, that might lead to tiflis. If women don't have a full education, in the pre-modern world, it was difficult for women to be fully educated for a variety of reasons, then that might lead to tiflis. Today, where they can have the full education, you give them the full education. That's the best way to avoid tiflis. So a very creative rereading of the category of tiflis that fits with Rav Lichtenstein's idea that learning Torah for everyone, including women, is about avodas Hashem and needs to be done in a serious way whenever one engages Torah.
Okay, I want to thank each of the panelists for adding depth to our appreciation of Rav Lichtenstein and his legacy. And I thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Dr.
We'd like
Price.
to invite, thank you very much. We'd like to invite Rabbi Elliot Schrier, the rabbi of Congregation Bnei Yeshurun, to conclude today's program with some final remarks. I want to mention Mr. Terry Novetzky. My note has been mentioned here much. He was also one of the founders of Mayanot. So I didn't attend Mayanot, but I was also there at the beginning of Mayanot teaching. Vakasha.
Okay, in offering some closing remarks, I will take one opportunity to echo what many of the speakers have said so far, and just thanking all the many people that contributed to making this happen. To our hosts, to my dear colleague and friend, Rabbi Chaim Strachler, thank you for hosting us this morning. And to the many people who planned this event, thank you for giving us the opportunity to together perpetuate the memory of our Rebbe. I'll begin by sharing with you a piece of feedback that I once received from a congregant. This was before I came to Teaneck, before I came to New Jersey. I was the rabbi of a small shul in the Bronx called the Albert Einstein Synagogue, serving the Jewish students at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And at one point, we did a survey. We would intermittently do these surveys to try to get feedback from the members of our kehillah to see how we were doing, what we were doing well, areas where we could use some improvement. And perhaps the greatest piece of feedback I ever received was as follows. This is a quote from an anonymous student that said the following: "The shul's doing great, exclamation point. I love coming to shul on Shabbos morning and hanging with my boys in the back." Boys is spelled B-O-Y-Z. Mind you, this is someone who was accepted to medical school. Evidently, there is no spelling section on the MCAT. But I love hanging with my boys in the back. I love Rabbi Schrier's inspiring drushot and shiurim. One question, though. Who is, quote, Rav Lichtenstein? And why is he so important that Rabbi Schrier needs to quote him in literally every single speech? That was the piece of feedback I received. The board got a kick out of that. They shared it with me. I will confess that initially I took exception to the feedback because I can think of at least 3 times that I didn't quote Rav Lichtenstein during my years in Einstein, maybe even 4. But in addition to being a valuable piece of feedback on the importance of occasional source diversification, of course it is a reflection of the profound, deeply profound impact that Rav Lichtenstein had on me. And I share that with you in a sense that is different from all the other speakers that we've heard from until this point. Because each of them can point to that profound impact, and many of us in this room can point to that profound impact. But I'd say, speaking very personally, it resonates in a slightly different way because I say without any false measure of humility, I am by far the least qualified person to speak at this event from all of the many illustrious speakers that you've heard from this morning. When I was initially asked to contribute to this 10th Yahrzeit of Rav Lichtenstein to this event, I initially demurred. I said, I'm eager to participate to whatever degree I can. My first reaction was, it is a Sunday morning, and I have 4 children under the age of 10, so I need to ask my wife. I think that's something that Rav Lichtenstein would have approved of and endorsed. But I also said, as much as I'd be eager to participate and to listen, I truly do not feel qualified to speak. I arrived in Yeshiva in Cong in 2007, 2008, towards the very end of Rav Lichtenstein's many decades-long endeavor of Ha'amadas Talmidim Harbe. I spent a year in the Yeshiva, only 1 zman in Rav Lichtenstein's Schrier, 1 zman kayetz, and I did not merit, l'tza'ari, the deep personal relationship that every other speaker here had, and that so many of you in this room had as well. And it's something that has always pained me, and it's something that I did not have the opportunity to really fully experience. And yet, af al pi chen, it is no hyperbole to say that my minimal exposure to Rav Lichtenstein was profoundly life-changing and transformative. It has very much shaped and molded who I am on every level. On a personal level, my oldest son is named for Rav Lichtenstein. His picture sits in my office. His personal example is something that I think about all the time in my humble attempt to be Talmidav Shel Aharon. It's expressed in my teaching, whether it be my teaching Torah in terms of Havayos to Abaye V'Rava or offering broader religious perspective, my attempts to offer broader Hashkafas HaTorah and Hashkafas HaChaim. It's expressed in the many instances when I quote Rav Lichtenstein directly, as highlighted by that former congregant, and the many instances when I don't, but it's simply obvious that his approach and his thinking has shaped the way I approach things and think about things. It's present in every aspect of my life. Rav Aharon used to say about Chazal's dictum, Adam kona olamo b'sha'a achas, that one can acquire one's portion in a single moment, that it need not only refer to one's portion in the world to come, but it can also be expressive of one's impact on others. Rav Aharon used to talk about an iconic kumsitz that Rav Amital held in 1974 after spending several months away from the yeshiva after the Yom Kippur War. He spent an entire zman away from the yeshiva. But then he came back and had one kumsitz where he brought the Talmidei HaYeshiva together, they sang together, and Rav Aharon said that Rav Amital in that moment gave to his Talmidim and gave to himself something that surpassed all of the shiurim that he missed over the course of that zman. He was kona olama b'sha'a achas. And I think many of us felt that there were many such moments in the presence of Rav Aharon. Just quiet moments, recognizing that you were in the presence of greatness in an intangible but an acute way. We recognized that almost through osmosis, we were absorbing the greatness that he exemplified. Ultimately, I did agree to speak at this event, perhaps as a closing statement of how even those who did not have the depth and breadth of exposure, those decades-long interactions with Rav Aharon, can, in their small way, attempt to carry forward his legacy. I know it's almost superfluous to quote from The Source of Faith is Faith Itself in current company, but if you'll indulge me in doing so as one concluding note. There's one line in the essay that I don't think is frequently focused on. It's a line that I undoubtedly missed my first time reading it, but strikes me on the many, many occasions that I've returned to it. Towards the very beginning of Rav Aharon's very personal essay about his own emunah, about his own source of faith. He begins The Source of Faith is Faith Itself by expressing how in his early years, and even to a degree in his later years, his source of faith was exposure to greatness on part of his own rebbeim. He writes, without question, during my formative years and to a lesser extent beyond, the source and bulwark of my commitment was not so much a cluster of abstract factors or arguments as key persons. He goes on to highlight what he gained from his rebbeim, the Rav Hutner, Rav Aharon Soloveitchik, and the way in which their simple presence in his life was a foundation for his faith. But before he does that, he writes the following. This may make my response less valuable for readers who have no access to my sources of strength and inspiration. And in Zichron, he used to say that he lamented the fact that his own Talmidim never had the same exposure to greatness that he was privileged to have, that they never got to interact with his rebbeim. When I would hear him say that, or when I heard it quoted in his name, I couldn't help but doing so with an ironic smile. Because as much as I know that Rav Aharon meant that sincerely and honestly and with the characteristic humility that really defined his essence, in this one instance, for all of our Rebbe's depth, his sophistication, his moral clarity, in this one instance, we knew that we knew better. We knew that we did have access to the greatness that he had. We did have that exposure. And it certainly defined all of us and was indeed the bedrock of our faith, just as it was his. The question that Rav Aharon begins the essay with is a quote from Matthew Arnold. He quotes about a question about who props your mind in bad days. And I think for many of us, the answer to that question is clear. When we are asked, who prop thou asked in these bad days my mind, we know exactly what the answer is. And not only who props up our mind, but also our hearts and our souls in days that are dark, in days that are difficult, in days that we miss him dearly. His memory still continues to prop us up and carry us forward. May our Rebbe's memory continue to prop up our minds, our hearts, and our souls through all the bad, difficult, and dark times. And in turn, may we honor his legacy and be sure to perpetuate it and carry it forward. Yehi Zichron Baruch.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. I just want to thank the committee, which was Rabbi Helfgott, Rabbi Zuckier, Rabbi Gideon Rothstein, Rabbi Aaron Ross, Rabbi Garden Schwartz, and Rabbi Yonatan Shai Fridman, and of course all the sponsors. Thank you very much for joining.